If you've spent time in sims, you've probably had this happen. The rear starts rotating a little and you make a correction, but the next correction ends up bigger than you expected and suddenly the wheel is moving more and more, like you're trying to catch up to the slide instead of just letting the car settle. Then later you watch the replay and realize the car wasn't even doing anything crazy. It just started rotating a bit and everything after that came from the way you reacted to it. So the strange question is why something that small can suddenly feel so sketchy in a sim when the car itself never really did anything extreme. Once you spend enough time driving in sims, you start noticing this pattern over and over again, where the rear steps out slightly and you catch it, but the correction comes just a little later than it should have. So the wheel moves again and the throttle changes, and now the car starts moving back to the other direction, even though the original slide wasn't very big to begin with. I still catch myself doing this sometimes, where the car drifts a little wider than I expected and my hands move quicker than they really need to. And then suddenly I'm reacting to what just happened instead of what the car is actually doing in that moment. Then later when I watch the replay, everything looks surprisingly calm, which is always the funny part because while I was driving it, it felt like things were starting to get out of hand. Drifting makes this really obvious too, because angle starts building and the steering stays turned just slightly longer than necessary. So the rear keeps walking outward and now the slide begins to look unstable even though the car never actually snapped. Nothing crazy really happened, but the timing between the car and the driver slowly separated. And once that happens, the inputs start stacking on top of each other until the whole situation begins to feel sketchy, even though the car itself still is pretty manageable. And the weird part is, the reason this happens isn't what most people think. Most people assume the answer has something to do with the physics of the sim, but what's actually missing is something your brain relies on heavily when you're driving a real car: your body. When a real car starts rotating, your body usually senses it almost immediately, because the movement travels through the seat and through your hips, and your inner ear picks up the rotation before your eyes even fully process what's happening. So by the time your brain decides to react, the correction actually begins much earlier in the slide than it would in a sim. And because it starts earlier, the steering input usually ends up being much smaller. In a sim, almost all of that physical feedback disappears, which means your brain suddenly has fewer signals to work with, and most of the time it just ends up relying on visual information first. So when the rear of the car begins rotating, you usually see it before anything else, and that small delay might only be a fraction of a second, but it means the car has already rotated a little further by the time your brain decides to react. Now the correction has to be bigger to catch the same slide, and that bigger correction unsettles the car again, which leads to another reaction, and before long, what started as a small rotation becomes a chain of increasingly larger inputs. This is usually where panic inputs start appearing, where the throttle lifts suddenly or the steering moves further than it really needed to, or the driver holds angle longer than the car actually required. The car might still be completely recoverable through all of this, but the timing between the driver and the car slowly separates. And once that timing goes, the whole thing begins to feel sketchy, even though the physics themselves never really changed. After enough time in sims though, something interesting begins to happen, because your brain slowly adapts to the limited feedback and starts learning how to read smaller signals earlier. Instead of waiting to see the car rotate, you begin noticing the weight building in the steering wheel, or the sound of the engine climbing or dropping, or the way the scenery moves across the windshield when the rear begins stepping out. Once those signals start making sense, the inputs naturally get smaller, and the throttle becomes steadier, and the steering wheel stops moving so aggressively because your brain is now predicting the slide instead of reacting late to it. And when that happens, the car suddenly looks much calmer even though nothing about the sim actually changed. the driver simply learned how to read the information the sim provides. And that's really why sim racing can feel harder at first, not because the cars are unrealistic, but because the sim removes a lot of the physical information your brain normally uses to control a real car. Once you adapt to driving with that limited feedback, the car starts making sense again. And when those same drivers get back into a real car with all the physical cues returning at once, everything suddenly feels even clearer. I'm curious if you've noticed that moment in Sims where the car isn't really out of control, but it suddenly feels like it. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.